How does a powerful noblewoman end up an accomplice to a brutal murder, buried alive inside a freezing convent wall? The scandal of the Nun of Monza isn't just a tale of forbidden lust. It is the dark anatomy of a patriarchal dumping ground, thrown into a cage by her own father to save his fortune. Virginia Maria de Leyva was pushed to the absolute psychological brink. When her desperate rebellion ended in blood, the system didn't punish the untouchable nobleman who actually swung the blade. Instead, they buried her alive, using her destroyed life as a bloody shield to hide the sins of men. She was born Maria de Leyva in 1575 in Milan. The geopolitical landscape of her birth is critical. Milan was a territory operating under the heavy, militarized control of the Spanish Empire. The de Leyva family belonged to the absolute highest tier of the aristocratic elite. Mariana's great-grandfather, Antonio de Leyva, had been a legendary, ruthless Spanish commander who essentially ruled Milan with an iron fist. The family possessed vast estates, immense political influence, and a terrifying reputation. But in the cold, ledger-driven world of the late 16th century nobility, Mariana's prestigious bloodline did not protect her. It condemned her. Her father, Lord Martino de Leyva, operated under the strict, unforgiving laws of primogeniture and patriarchal economics. To maintain the family's massive fortune, their territorial power, and their military leverage, the estate had to be passed down entirely intact to the male heirs. In this economic system, sons were an investment. Daughters were a profound biological liability. To marry a daughter off to another noble family of equal standing required a dowry. In the upper echelons of Spanish-Italian aristocracy, a dowry was not a token gift. It was a massive, crippling transfer of wealth, encompassing thousands of gold coins, lucrative land deeds, and ancestral properties. If a nobleman had multiple daughters, paying their dowries could literally bankrupt his estate, fracturing the family's political power for generations. Lord Martino looked at his infant daughter, Mariana, and made a cold mathematical calculation. He simply refused to pay a noble marriage dowry. He had sons to protect and an empire to maintain. The alternative to a marriage dowry was a spiritual dowry, paid to a local convent. This was a fraction of the cost, a one-time, highly discounted fee paid to the Catholic Church to permanently take the girl off the family's balance sheet. Mariana's fate was sealed before she could even walk. This is where the psychological trauma of her existence took root. Mariana did not grow up in a home filled with warmth and expectation. From her earliest cognitive moments, she was subjected to a targeted, relentless campaign of psychological grooming. The adults in her life did not raise her to be a woman. They raised her to be a ghost. In the de Leyva household, Mariana was constantly reminded that she did not belong to the secular world. While her brothers were educated in statecraft, swordplay, and economics, preparing to inherit the earth, Mariana was isolated. Her toys were replaced with rosaries and religious icons. Her father and her tutors employed aggressive psychological conditioning. They painted the outside world as a chaotic, filthy, and highly dangerous place, telling the young girl that her only safety and her only value to her family lay in total submission to the church. She was taught that her body was a sin waiting to happen. She was programmed to believe that by sacrificing her freedom, she was performing a noble, heroic act that would secure her family's honor and guarantee her own salvation. But a child's mind cannot be entirely fooled by theological rhetoric. On a primal biological level, Mariana knew she was being thrown away. She internalized the devastating reality that her father valued his estates and his land deeds vastly more than he valued her life. This foundational rejection created a massive, aching void in her psyche, a desperate, starving need for validation and human connection that would eventually tear her world apart. In 1588, at the incredibly vulnerable age of 13, the grooming reached its ultimate conclusion. Mariana was physically removed from her family home and forced into the convent of Santa Margherita in the nearby town of Monza. The Catholic Church actively facilitated this mass imprisonment of young girls in exchange for profound financial and political power. The forced monasticism of aristocratic daughters was an open secret. It was a highly organized, highly profitable transaction between the nobility and the religious authorities. The church accepted the discounted spiritual dowries and heavy financial endowments from fathers like Maria de Leyva to lock their daughters away. In return, institutions like the Convent of Santa Margherita acted as luxurious dumping grounds for the unwanted women of the elite. When 13-year-old Mariana stepped through the heavy wooden doors of the convent, she was forced to participate in a terrifying psychological ritual, the taking of the veil. She was dressed in a bridal gown, symbolizing her marriage to Christ, and then her hair was violently shorn from her head. She was stripped of her civilian clothes, her family connections, and her very name. Maria de Leyva was pronounced dead to the world. She was reborn as Sister Virginia Maria. She was forced to take permanent, unbreakable vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But inside the walls of Santa Margherita, Virginia's reality was a bizarre, deeply damaging paradox. Because of her family's immense wealth, she was not treated as an ordinary nun. She was legally the Countess of Monza. From behind the iron grates of Santa Margherita, this teenage girl actually wielded sovereign authority over the surrounding town. She collected taxes, managed vast estates, and settled civil disputes. Inside the convent, she ate fine foods and wore habits tailored from expensive fabrics. Yet, this gilded cage was entirely hollow. She could order a man jailed for tax evasion, but she lacked the fundamental human freedom to walk out her own front door. Trapped in a state of terminal boredom and deep resentment, her absolute power only magnified her internal despair. The severe emotional starvation imposed by her father was pushing her toward a breaking point. She was looking for a way, anyway, to feel alive. She was trapped in a highly unnatural, tightly controlled environment that actively starved her of normal human development. And she was not alone. The convent was filled with dozens of other women who shared her exact fate, angry, grieving, bored aristocrats who had been forcibly discarded by their fathers and brothers. The atmosphere inside Santa Margherita was thick with suppressed rage, bitter social hierarchies, and suffocating claustrophobia. It was a psychological pressure cooker. As Virginia transitioned from a traumatized teenager into a young woman in her early 20s, the biological and emotional realities of her existence began to set in. The heavy, unyielding silence of the convent could not suppress her basic human instincts. The human brain is not designed to endure absolute emotional starvation. Without physical touch, without romantic affection, and without the freedom to chart her own destiny, A deep, dangerous desperation began to take hold. Maria de Leyva could not simply turn off her biology. The severe emotional starvation imposed by her father and enforced by the Catholic Church was pushing her toward a breaking point. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, looking for any possible way to feel alive, and looking directly back at her from an estate just beyond the convent walls was a man who specialized in breaking the rules. The stage was set for a catastrophic rebellion. The convent of Santa Margherita in Monza was an architectural paradox. From the outside, it presented the formidable, impenetrable walls of a holy sanctuary. But from the inside, for a young woman overflowing with vitality, it was an airless tomb. As Virginia Maria de Leyva navigated her 20s, the crushing psychological weight of her permanent imprisonment began to physically manifest. The mechanics of her rebellion were deeply rooted in the biology of starvation. When a human being is systematically deprived of food, the body eventually consumes its own muscle tissue to survive. Emotional and psychological starvation operates on the exact same ruthless principle. Virginia had been locked away since she was a teenager, entirely deprived of romantic affection, physical touch, and the fundamental human right to chart the course of her own life. Her father had mandated that she would never exist as a woman. The Catholic Church had formally certified her social death, but beneath the heavy wool of her aristocratic habit, her biology refused to die. Directly adjacent to the high brick walls of the convent garden stood the estate of Count Gianpaolo Ossio. To call Count Ossio a romantic hero would be a grotesque historical inaccuracy. He was a wealthy, entitled, and deeply dangerous aristocrat. He was a man known throughout the region for his violent temper, his arrogance, and his absolute disregard for the law. In 17th century Spanish-controlled Italy, wealthy noblemen like Ossio operated with terrifying impunity. They employed private militias, murdered their rivals in the streets, and essentially treated the local populace as their personal property. But to a woman dying of sensory and emotional starvation, danger is incredibly seductive. From the upper windows of the convent, Virginia could look down into Ossio's manicured gardens. She could see him walking his grounds, entirely free. He represented everything the church and her father had violently denied her: autonomy, risk, and the unfiltered, chaotic reality of the outside world. The courtship between the Nun of Monza and the violent nobleman did not begin with poetry. It began with the cold, calculated breaching of a fortress. It started with prolonged, silent glances exchanged across the physical boundary of the convent wall. Then, the boundary was tested. Ossio, a man entirely unaccustomed to being denied anything he desired, began to pace the street beneath her window. In a highly monitored environment like a convent, establishing contact required an elaborate, treacherous network of accomplices. The affair was facilitated by the deep corruption that already existed within the local religious hierarchy. A local priest, Paolo Arrigoni, a man who possessed a dark, cynical disposition and a close friendship with Ossio, acted as the initial conduit. Through Arrigoni and a few carefully bribed lay sisters within the convent, highly secretive, passionate letters began to pass back and forth between the Countess and the Count. For her entire life, she had been told she was a financial burden, a liability, a ghost. Now, one of the most powerful, dangerous men in the city was risking his life and his reputation simply to communicate with her. The letters acted as a defibrillator to her dormant psyche. For the very first time in her existence, she was desired, she was seen. The affair rapidly escalated from written words to physical proximity. Ozio, utilizing his immense wealth and a network of corrupt locksmiths, had duplicate keys forged for the heavy wooden doors that separated the convent gardens from the secular world. Under the cover of night, after the convent had fallen into its mandated freezing silence, Gianpaolo Ozio began to secretly enter the grounds of Santa Margherita. This was an act of staggering, terrifying risk. In the 17th century, the violation of a cloistered convent by a layman was a massive secular and ecclesiastical crime. If Ozio were caught by the Spanish guard, he could be executed. If Virginia were caught, the Inquisition would utterly destroy her. But it was precisely this adrenaline, this absolute razor-thin proximity to death and ruin, that cemented their bond. For Virginia, the terror of discovery was the ultimate counterweight to the suffocating, monotonous safety of her cage. Their physical relationship lasted for years. It was not a fleeting moment of weakness. It was a sustained, highly organized double life. During the day, Virginia Maria de Leyva sat in the parlor, wearing the somber habit of her order, collecting taxes, managing the convent's ledgers, and dispensing feudal justice to the citizens of Monza. But at night, she shed the identity forced upon her by her father and reclaimed the stolen autonomy of her own body in the arms of Gianpaolo Ozio. This dangerous, illicit romance was a profound psychological rebellion. Every time she unlocked the garden door for Ozio, she was actively tearing up the financial contract her father had signed to lock her away. She was reclaiming her existence. But biology is an unforgiving ledger, and a system built entirely on the suppression of human nature cannot sustain a rebellion of this magnitude indefinitely. The physical reality of their affair eventually caught up with them in the most terrifying way possible. Virginia became pregnant. Imagine the sheer suffocating panic of her reality. She was a cloistered nun, the recognized Countess of Monza, and a highly visible public figure. To be discovered pregnant was not merely a scandal, it was an automatic death sentence for her reputation, a catastrophic humiliation for the de Leyva family, and a guarantee of brutal physical punishment by the Catholic hierarchy. Virginia had to conceal the physical changes of her body from dozens of other women she lived with. She bound her stomach, altered the draping of her heavy wool habits, and increasingly withdrew from the communal life of the convent, using her feudal authority and aristocratic status to demand privacy that ordinary nuns were never granted. She essentially weaponized her own social privilege to hide her crime. Tragically, her first pregnancy ended in disaster. She delivered a stillborn child in absolute terrifying secrecy within the walls of her cell. The psychological trauma of enduring labor alone in the dark, entirely unable to scream or call for a physician, is unfathomable. To then hold a dead infant, knowing she could not mourn it, could not bury it in a marked grave, and had to dispose of the evidence of her own flesh and blood to protect her life, deepened the fracture in her mind. Yet the trauma of the stillbirth did not end the affair. It bound Virginia and Ozio closer together in a dark, highly toxic web of shared secrets and mutual complicity. The nocturnal visits continued, driven by trauma, addiction to the risk, and a desperate, clinging need for survival. Inevitably, she fell pregnant a second time. This time, the pregnancy progressed to full term. In the summer of 1604, Virginia went into labor again. Aided by two deeply compromised, fiercely loyal accomplices within the convent, Sister Ottavia and Sister Benedetta, she gave birth to a living, breathing daughter. The immediate aftermath of the birth was a masterstroke of desperate, terrifying logistics. Virginia could not keep the infant. Every second the child remained inside Santa Margherita was a ticking time bomb that threatened to destroy them all. In the dead of night, the newborn baby was wrapped in cloth, smuggled through the stone corridors, and passed through the heavy garden doors directly into the waiting arms of Gianpaolo Osio. Osio took the infant back to his neighboring estate. He legally acknowledged the child as his own illegitimate daughter, naming her Alma Francesca Margherita. To the outside world, he claimed the mother was simply an unknown woman of low birth. He hired wet nurses and raised the child practically in the shadow of the convent walls, where her true mother remained trapped. Virginia had to endure the excruciating psychological torture of hearing her own daughter cry from the neighboring estate, knowing she could never publicly claim her, hold her, or raise her. She had reclaimed her body, but the patriarchal system had still successfully stolen her child. The birth of Alma Francesca Margherita raised the stakes of their deception to an unmanageable fever pitch. A secret of this magnitude, involving forged keys, midnight deliveries, smuggled infants, and corrupt priests, requires too many accomplices to remain buried forever. The convent of Santa Margherita was a closed, claustrophobic ecosystem. It was an environment fueled by boredom, bitter rivalries, and the strict surveillance of women by other women. Virginia had used her immense power as the countess to intimidate the other nuns into looking the other way. The Sisters of Santa Margherita knew that to accuse a de Leyva of sexual misconduct was to risk the wrath of the most powerful family in Milan. But intimidation only works until the resentment boils over. The fragile, highly explosive foundation of Virginia's double life was cracking. She had spent years walking a terrifying tightrope over an abyss, but a single fatal mistake was about to be made. A lay sister within the convent had been watching the shadows in the garden. She had noticed the shifting weight beneath the countess's habit. She knew exactly what was happening in the dark, and she was preparing to use that information to blow the convent of Santa Margherita entirely apart. The story of a desperate, starved woman reaching out for love was about to violently transform into a story of absolute cold-blooded murder. The convent of Santa Margherita was not a sanctuary of quiet reflection. It was a panopticon. It was a closed, highly pressurized ecosystem where dozens of women lived shoulder to shoulder, day after day, year after year. In such a claustrophobic environment, privacy is an absolute physical impossibility. Every whisper is heard, every shifted glance is registered, and every secret eventually ferments into a weapon. Virginia Maria de Leyva had managed to orchestrate an incredibly dangerous double life. She had given birth to a living daughter, smuggled the infant out of the convent walls, and continued her illicit nocturnal affair with Count Gianpaolo Osio. She had used her immense aristocratic power as the Countess of Monza to intimidate the other nuns into a terrified silence. Her immediate accomplices, Sister Ottavia and Sister Benedetta, were deeply compromised, bound to her by a toxic mixture of loyalty, fear, and shared guilt. But intimidation only works on those who have something to lose. The fragile, highly explosive foundation of Virginia's survival was about to be shattered by a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The fatal catalyst of this tragedy was born from the strict, unforgiving class hierarchy inside a 17th century Italian convent. The walls of Santa Margherita did not erase the brutal social divisions of the outside world. They magnified them. The convent was divided into two distinct classes. There were the choir nuns, aristocratic women like Virginia, who brought massive financial endowments, wore fine habits, and spent their days in prayer or administration. Then there were the lay sisters. Lay sisters were women drawn from the peasant and working classes. They did not bring wealth to the convent. They brought their physical labor. They were the servants of the institution. They scrubbed the freezing stone floors, hauled the water, washed the heavy woolen habits, and emptied the chamber pots. They were treated as second-class citizens by the aristocratic nuns, expected to be invisible, silent, and infinitely subservient. One of these lay sisters was a woman named Caterina de Maida. Caterina was a woman ground down by the grueling, thankless physical labor of the convent. She watched Virginia de Leyva, a woman who had taken the exact same vows of poverty and chastity, eat fine foods, wear tailored clothes, and wield absolute tyrannical authority over the local peasantry. The hypocrisy was glaring, and the resentment within Caterina was deep and bitter. Crucially, Caterina had meticulously tracked these illicit nocturnal movements. She had noticed the subtle telling changes in the countess's body during her pregnancies. She had seen the duplicate keys, the whispered conversations with corrupt priests, and the nocturnal movements toward the garden door. Caterina knew exactly what was happening in the dark. Realizing the explosive, world-altering power of the information she held, Caterina de Maida made a calculated, incredibly dangerous decision. She decided to weaponize her knowledge. She began to blackmail the most powerful woman in Monza. The exact nature of Caterina's demands is lost to the fragmentary records of the Inquisition, but the psychological reality of the confrontation is undeniable. A peasant lay sister cornered an aristocratic countess. Caterina threatened to bypass the local, easily corrupted authorities and take her knowledge directly to the highest religious power in the region, the Archbishop of Milan, Cardinal Federico Borromeo. She threatened to expose the forged keys, the smuggled infant, and the years of sexual transgression. Imagine the sheer suffocating panic that seized Virginia de Leyva. If Caterina spoke, Virginia's life was effectively over. In 17th century Italy, the exposure of a nun's sexual relationship did not result in a simple dismissal. It meant absolute terrifying ruin. It meant public humiliation, the immediate stripping of her feudal titles, and the absolute destruction of the de Leyva family's political honor. More terrifyingly, it guaranteed a brutal, physical punishment by the Catholic hierarchy, most likely permanent solitary immurement. For Giampaolo Ossio, the stakes were equally devastating. While he was a powerful nobleman, impregnating a cloistered nun of the de Leyva family was a massive secular and ecclesiastical crime. If the scandal broke, the Spanish authorities in Milan would be forced to act. He risked losing his estates, his social standing, and potentially his head. They were cornered. Virginia was dragged directly into the epicenter of a crisis. She could no longer manage through intimidation or aristocratic privilege. She was paralyzed by fear. She was a woman who had never been taught how to navigate the world. She had only been taught how to submit to men or command servants. Faced with the imminent destruction of her life and the life of her hidden daughter, her executive function completely shut down. She became a terrified, passive hostage to the situation. But Count Gianpaolo Ossio did not react with panic. He reacted with the cold, casual, and absolute violence that was entirely characteristic of his class. To Ossio, Caterina D'Ameda was not a human being with a legitimate grievance. She was a disposable peasant. She was a minor, irritating obstacle threatening his comfortable, highly privileged setup and his aristocratic lover. In his mind, the solution was not negotiation. The solution was extermination. Ossio decided that Caterina D'Ameda had to die. The murder of Caterina D'Ameda in the summer of 1606 was not a clean professional assassination. It was a messy, brutal, and horrifyingly intimate act of butchery. Ossio, aided by a trusted accomplice from his own estate, utilized his forged keys to infiltrate the convent grounds in the dead of night. Maria de Leyva did not strike the fatal blow. There is no historical evidence to suggest she held the weapon. But in the eyes of the law and in the terrifying reality of the moment, her silence sealed Caterina's fate. Virginia knew Ossio was coming. She knew his violent temper. She was trapped in an impossible, horrifying psychological vice. If she sounded the alarm and turned Ossio into the Spanish Guard, she would instantly expose her own affair, her illegitimate child, and effectively sign her own death warrant. If she remained silent, she became an accomplice to the murder of a woman she lived with. She chose silence. The instinct for self-preservation, warped by decades of institutional abuse and terror, overrode her morality. She stayed in her cell, listening to the echoing silence of the stone corridors, knowing exactly what was happening in the dark. Ossio and his accomplice cornered Caterina D'Ameda within the convent walls. The exact details of the struggle were later extracted during the Inquisition's torture sessions, painting a picture of sheer terror. They murdered the lay sister brutally, striking her down to permanently silence her blackmail. But killing a woman inside a closed, highly monitored convent is only the first half of the problem. Hiding the corpse is an entirely different logistical nightmare. Ossio could not risk dragging a bleeding body out through the convent gardens and across the streets of Monza to his own estate. The risk of being seen by the night watch or a sleepless nun was too high. They had to conceal the body within the walls of Santa Margherita. In a frantic, grisly attempt to dispose of the evidence, Ossio and his accomplice attempted to hide Caterina's remains. When a quick burial proved impossible in the stone infrastructure of the convent, the horror escalated. They dismembered the lay sister. They hacked apart the body of a woman whose only crime was threatening the hypocrisy of her superiors. They gathered her remains and threw them down a deep, disused well or wood store located on the convent grounds, covering the opening with heavy stones and debris. Ossio then slipped out of the convent, locking the garden door behind him, returning to the safety of his aristocratic estate as if nothing had happened. He left Virginia Maria de Leyva behind to deal with the psychological and physical aftermath of the butchery. The following morning, the convent of Santa Margherita awoke to a missing lay sister. The psychological toll on Virginia during the subsequent weeks is unfathomable. She was no longer just a nun who had broken her vow of chastity. She was an active accomplice to a gruesome murder. She had to wake up every morning, don her heavy aristocratic habit, and walk the stone corridors, knowing that the rotting, dismembered corpse of Caterina de Meda was hidden just yards away beneath the floorboards. She had to sit in the choir stalls, reciting the divine office, breathing in the cold air of the convent, terrified that the smell of decomposition would eventually seep through the stones. Virginia utilized her absolute authority as the convent's superior to execute a desperate, clumsy cover-up. When the other nuns inevitably began to ask questions about Caterina's sudden disappearance, Virginia lied to their faces. She looked at the women she had lived with for decades and calmly stated that Caterina had simply run away in the middle of the night, abandoning her vows to escape the grueling labor of the convent. Because lay sisters were viewed as second-class citizens, a runaway was not entirely uncommon, and the aristocratic nuns were initially willing to accept the explanation. Virginia used her immense feudal power to aggressively shut down any further inquiries. She commanded silence, threatening severe punishment for any nun who continued to gossip about the missing woman. But a murdered woman hidden in a convent well cannot be erased by an aristocratic decree. The lie was fundamentally unstable. The other nuns, particularly those who had known Caterina well, were highly suspicious. They knew Caterina had no money, no outside contacts, and nowhere to run. Furthermore, the two accomplices to Virginia's affair, Sister Octavia and Sister Benedetta, were slowly unraveling. They knew about the murder. The psychological weight of carrying the secret of a butchered lay sister was pushing them toward a total nervous breakdown. The atmosphere inside Santa Margarita turned completely toxic. It became an environment defined by intense paranoia, whispered accusations, and suffocating mounting dread. Virginia was entirely trapped in a prison of her own making. She could not sleep. She could not trust anyone. She was tied to Gianpaolo Osio, not by love, but by the cold, heavy chain of shared, bloody guilt. The rumors could not be contained within the walls of Monza. They leaked out into the town, carried by visiting family members and delivery men who sensed the palpable terror radiating from the nuns. The whispers grew louder. They spoke of a missing sister, a corrupt countess, and the violent nobleman who paced his gardens next door. Eventually, the whispers breached the borders of Monza. They traveled the few short miles south to the city of Milan. They bypassed the local, easily bribed magistrates and landed directly on the desk of the most powerful, unyielding religious authority in northern Italy. The desperate, bloody cover-up had failed. The horrific reality of what had occurred inside the convent of Santa Margarita was about to be dragged into the unforgiving light of the 17th century judicial system. And it was in the immediate aftermath of this exposure that the patriarchal justice system would reveal its absolute terrifying hypocrisy. The state and the church were preparing to move, but they were not coming to serve justice for a murdered peasant woman. They were coming to protect the reputation of the men in power, and they needed a female scapegoat to absorb the entire devastating shockwave of the scandal. The whispers that seeped out of the convent of Santa Margarita did not simply evaporate into the Italian air. They metastasized. They traveled from the local markets of Monza directly into the highly fortified, bureaucratic heart of Milan. In the late summer of 1607, the fragile, bloody cover-up orchestrated by Virginia Maria de Leyva and Count Gianpaolo Osio finally collapsed. The Catholic Church and the Spanish secular authorities were forced to act, but we must be absolutely clear about their motivations. They did not mobilize because a peasant lay sister named Caterina de Meda had been brutally murdered and thrown down a well. In the grand, ruthless hierarchy of 17th century Italy, the life of a working-class woman was statistically worthless. The authorities mobilized because the rumors of a pregnant, murderous, aristocratic nun were causing a massive public relations catastrophe. The Catholic Church was desperately trying to enforce the strict moral reforms of the Council of Trent, designed to prove to the Protestant world that Catholic institutions were pure, holy, and incorruptible. Suddenly, right in the heart of Lombardy, the most powerful family in the region had a daughter who was allegedly running a murderous sexual syndicate from behind the altar. If the church did not crush this scandal immediately, their absolute moral authority over the masses would be permanently fractured. The man dispatched to investigate was Cardinal Federico Borromeo, the Archbishop of Milan. In standard Catholic history, Borromeo is frequently romanticized as a saintly intellectual reformer. But in the context of the Monza scandal, we must analyze him through a forensic, secular lens. Borromeo was the ultimate unyielding enforcer of patriarchal dominance. He was a highly educated, terrifyingly efficient administrator who viewed the women in his convents not as human beings, but as institutional property that required strict, aggressive management. When Borromeo's investigators arrived in Monza, the illusion of Virginia's feudal power shattered instantly. She was the Countess of Monza, but against the crushing weight of the Roman Catholic bureaucracy, her title was absolutely worthless. The investigators did not treat her with aristocratic deference. They treated her as a hostile, highly dangerous suspect. The psychological terror of the investigation was immediate. Borromeo's men began to isolate and interrogate the nuns. They knew exactly how to crack a closed, claustrophobic community. They applied relentless pressure to the weakest links in Virginia's chain of survival, her two immediate accomplices, Sister Ottavia and Sister Benedetta. These two women had carried the horrifying secret of Caterina's butchered body, the smuggled infant, and the forged keys for years. They were already suffering from severe psychological distress, completely unraveling under the weight of their own guilt and terror. As the Inquisition circled, Count Gianpaolo Osio, watching from his adjacent estate, realized that the net was closing. It is in this precise historical moment that the absolute horrifying hypocrisy of male privilege and patriarchal violence is perfectly exposed. When Osio realized that Ottavia and Benedetta were on the verge of confessing to Borromeo's investigators, he did not launch a daring rescue to save the women who had protected him. He did not step forward to take responsibility for the murder he had physically committed. He made a cold, sociopathic calculation. He decided to sever the loose ends. He decided to murder the remaining witnesses. Under the guise of a rescue mission, Osio secretly contacted Ottavia and Benedetta. He manipulated their profound terror, promising them that if they used the forged keys to escape the convent that night, he would smuggle them across the border to safety in Venetian territory. Desperate, terrified of the Inquisition, and completely dependent on male protection, the two nuns agreed. They fled Santa Margherita in the dead of night and met Osio in the dark. But Osio had no intention of saving them. He led them away from the convent and once they were isolated, the aristocratic lover revealed his true nature. He brutally attacked them. He threw Sister Benedetta into a deep, rushing local river, intending to drown her in the freezing water. He then turned on Sister Ottavia, drawing his blade and violently stabbing her multiple times, leaving her bleeding out in a deserted field. He walked away from the carnage, confident that he had permanently silenced the only eyewitnesses to the murder of Caterina de Meda. He then used his immense wealth, his aristocratic connections, and the inherent systemic loopholes designed specifically for men of his class to flee. The Spanish secular authorities, suddenly faced with the prospect of arresting a powerful nobleman, miraculously moved at a sluggish bureaucratic crawl. Ossio was allowed to comfortably escape across the border into the Republic of Venice, effectively vanishing from the jurisdiction of Milan. The system inherently protected the male perpetrator. It allowed the actual murderer to walk away. But Ossio's ruthless execution plan had a fatal flaw. He had failed to kill the nuns. Miraculously, both Sister Benedetta and Sister Ottavia survived his brutal attack. Benedetta managed to pull herself from the freezing river. Ottavia, bleeding heavily from her stab wounds, was discovered by local peasants. When the authorities reached the two broken, betrayed women, the dam of silence completely burst. Lying in agonizing pain, furious and utterly traumatized by the ultimate betrayal of the man they had risked their souls to protect, Ottavia and Benedetta confessed to everything. They detailed the forged keys. They described the midnight birth of Alma Francesca Margherita. And most damningly, they provided the exact horrifying details of how Count Gianpaolo Ossio had butchered Caterina de Meda and thrown her down the hidden well on the convent grounds. The authorities immediately searched the convent of Santa Margherita. They pulled away the stones and the debris, and deep within the dark, freezing water of the disused well, they found the rotting, dismembered remains of Caterina de Meda. The crime was no longer a rumor. It was physical, undeniable, and dripping with blood. The shockwave that hit Virginia Maria de Leyva was absolute and total. She was trapped inside her cell when the news broke. Imagine the profound, crushing psychological collapse she experienced in that moment. Her lover, the man who had represented her only lifeline to the outside world, the father of her child, had abandoned her. He had attempted to slaughter her closest friends. He had run away to save his own neck, leaving her completely alone, locked in a stone building, surrounded by the rotting evidence of his violence. She had absolutely nowhere to run. She was a woman. In 17th century Europe, an aristocratic woman possessed no independent wealth, no freedom of movement, and no legal autonomy. Her family, the mighty de Leyvas, instantly and aggressively disowned her to protect their own political standing. Her father had thrown her away to save money. Her family now threw her to the wolves to save face. Virginia was formally arrested by the ecclesiastical authorities. She was dragged out of the convent of Santa Margherita, the building that had served as her childhood prison, her feudal kingdom, and the site of her ultimate ruin. She was heavily guarded, stripped of all outward signs of aristocratic dignity, and transported to Milan to face the absolute terrifying wrath of Cardinal Federico Borromeo. The trial of Virginia Maria de Leyva is a textbook study in asymmetrical justice. The state and the church needed a scapegoat. They could not execute Count Ossio, who was safely hiding in Venetian territory. Because the male murderer had escaped the reach of the law, the entire devastating weight of the justice system was violently dropped onto the shoulders of the female hostage. Virginia was thrown into the prison of the Archiepiscopal Palace in Milan. For a woman who had spent her entire life as a recognized countess, the physical degradation of a 17th century dungeon was a profound psychological shock. But the true torture was not the cold stone or the lack of food. The true torture was the interrogation room. She was subjected to months of grueling, relentless questioning by Borromeo's elite inquisitors. The true cruelty of this process is laid bare when examining its gender dynamics. Here was a woman who had been starved of human affection, forced into a permanent vow of chastity against her will, and manipulated into a desperate affair by a violent man. Now she was forced to sit in a room filled entirely with celibate, highly educated, fiercely patriarchal men. They did not ask her about her trauma. They did not ask her why her father had locked her away. They did not care about the psychological desperation that drove her to Ossio. Instead, they aggressively dissected her sex life. They forced her to recount in humiliating, excruciating detail every physical encounter she had with Ossio. They forced her to describe the birth of her child. They cross-examined her panic, her terror, and her silence regarding the murder of Caterina. It was an institutionalized, psychological rape. The men of the church used her testimony to legally construct a narrative of inherent female depravity. They needed her to be a monster. If she was a monster, a lustful, wicked witch who had seduced a nobleman and masterminded a murder, then the Catholic Church and the patriarchal system were entirely absolved of their own crimes. If she was a monster, then her father was right to lock her away, and the convent system was perfectly justified. They weaponized her desperate survival instincts to validate the very system that had destroyed her. Under the crushing weight of the interrogations, isolated from the world, and threatened with extreme physical torture, Virginia's psychological resistance eventually broke. She confessed. She confessed to the affair, she confessed to the child, and she confessed to her complicity in the cover-up of the murder. She offered no grand defense. She was a broken, exhausted woman who simply wanted the psychological vivisection to end. With the confession secured, Cardinal Federico Borromeo and the elite power brokers of Milan gathered to determine her fate. A public execution, beheading or burning at the stake, was deemed politically impossible. Despite her crimes, she was still a de Leyva. Executing her in the public square would be a permanent, highly visible humiliation for one of the most powerful families in the Spanish Empire. But they could not allow her to live in normal imprisonment. She was the most infamous woman in Italy. Her very existence was a walking, breathing indictment of the convent system and aristocratic hypocrisy. They required a punishment that would physically erase her from the earth, a punishment that would simultaneously satisfy the bloodlust of the scandalized public, appease the embarrassed de Leyva family, and demonstrate the absolute, terrifying, and unforgiving power of the Catholic Church. Cardinal Borromeo looked at the broken Countess of Monza and drafted a sentence of unimaginable medieval cruelty. He did not order the executioner to take her life quickly. He ordered the masons to mix their mortar. He sentenced her to be swallowed by the earth while her heart was still beating. The Catholic Church and the Spanish aristocracy of Milan did not want a brief, bloody spectacle. They wanted an absolute erasure. To make the Countess of Monza disappear so completely that the public would forget she had ever existed, Cardinal Borromeo utilized a terrifying ancient ecclesiastical punishment known as murata viva, to be walled up alive. In the official sanitized ledgers of the church, this sentence was often euphemistically recorded as being placed in peace or enclosed for strict penance. The theological justification was that by removing a severe sinner from all worldly distractions, they were being given the ultimate merciful opportunity to pray, suffer, and purify their soul before God. But we must strip away this poetic religious language and look at the horrifying, secular reality of the sentence. It was a prolonged, meticulously engineered method of torture. It was a sanitized death penalty where the male hierarchy kept its hands technically clean of shedding blood, delegating the actual killing to the slow, agonizing forces of starvation, freezing temperatures, and disease. In late 1607, Virginia was stripped of her aristocratic habit, her title, and every remaining shred of her human dignity. Under heavy secret guard, she was transported from the dungeons of the archiepiscopal palace to the retreat house of Santa Valeria in Milan. Santa Valeria was an institution specifically designed to house fallen women, prostitutes, adulteresses, and disgraced nuns. But Virginia was not going to join their community. She was going into the foundations. She was led deep into the cold stone architecture of the building and forced into a specially prepared cell. To call it a room is a gross misrepresentation. It was a stone box. The dimensions were suffocatingly small, measuring barely a few feet across, offering just enough space for a human being to stand, sit, or lie, curled on a thin bed of straw. There were no windows. There was no fireplace. There was only the damp, unforgiving stone. Then the true psychological horror of the sentence commenced. Virginia was forced to sit in the freezing darkness and listen as the masons arrived. She listened to the wet, heavy sound of mortar being mixed in wooden troughs. She listened to the sharp scrape of the trowels. Brick by heavy brick, she watched as the men systematically built a solid, impenetrable wall across the open doorway of her cell. It is almost impossible to comprehend the sheer, mind-shattering terror of this moment. For a woman who had already spent her entire life trapped inside buildings against her will, watching the final sliver of light being extinguished, must have triggered a level of panic that defies human vocabulary. She was being buried while her heart was still beating. The masons did not seal the wall entirely. Near the very top, close to the ceiling, they left a single tiny aperture, a hole barely larger than a human fist. This hole was not for ventilation, and it certainly was not to provide her with light. It was a functional bureaucratic requirement. It was designed solely to allow a silent guard to pass her a meager daily ration of bread and a small jug of water. Once the final brick was laid and the mortar dried, the silence of the tomb descended. Virginia Maria de Leyva, the former Countess of Monza, was entombed. The year was 1608. She was 32 years old. The physical toll of this living death was absolute and devastating. Milanese winters are famously bitter, with freezing, damp cold that seeps directly into the bones. Virginia had no heavy wool, no fire, and no sunlight to warm her. She sat shivering in the absolute blackness, her joints aching and locking from the freezing damp. In the height of the Italian summers, the stone box transformed into a suffocating, airless oven. Because she could not stand fully or walk more than a single step, her muscles began to rapidly atrophy. Her body, already weakened by the stress of the trial and her prior pregnancies, began to physically break down. She suffered from scurvy due to the absolute lack of fresh nutrition in her bread and water diet. Her teeth loosened, her gums bled. She was forced to sit in her own filth, relying on the occasional begrudging charity of her unseen jailers to remove her waste. The stench of her own decaying biology became her permanent atmosphere. But the physical agony of the stone box was entirely eclipsed by the psychological vivisection of extreme sensory deprivation. Human neurology is not equipped to survive in an absolute void. When the brain is entirely starved of light, sound, and social interaction, it rapidly begins to consume itself. Within weeks of her entombment, Virginia's already fractured mind began to aggressively hallucinate. The darkness of her cell did not remain empty. It populated itself with the ghosts of her destroyed life. She was left alone in the pitch black with the agonizing, inescapable memories of her murdered companion, Caterina d'Almeida. She could likely still hear the sounds of the struggle, smelling the phantom scent of blood and decomposition. She was tortured by the memory of her executed lover, Giampaolo Ossio, the man who had seduced her, used her, and then violently betrayed her to save his own aristocratic skin. But the most profound, agonizing psychological torture was the memory of her daughter, Alma Francesca Margherita. Virginia had to sit in the dark, day after day, year after year, knowing that her child was out in the world, growing up without a mother, forever stained by the horrific legacy of her parents. She could not know if the child was safe, if she was loved, or if she had been discarded by the Ossio family. The grief of a stolen child magnified by the absolute silence of a stone tomb is a pain so vast and sharp. It is a miracle her heart did not simply stop beating from the shock. While Virginia rotted in the dark, losing her hair, her eyesight, and her grip on reality, the patriarchal machinery that had put her there continued to operate flawlessly in the sunlight. Cardinal Federico Borromeo returned to his luxurious palace. He continued to write highly praised theological tracts on morality, purity, and the necessity of church reform. He was celebrated by his peers as a visionary leader who had successfully cleansed his diocese of a filthy demonic stain. The de Leyva family, having successfully outsourced their shame to the walls of Santa Valeria, continued to amass wealth, marry their sons into royalty, and command armies. Count Giampaolo Ossio, the man whose hands were actually soaked in the blood of the murdered lay sister, and who had attempted to butcher 2 more women in a field, was never forced to sit in a dark cell. While he lived as a fugitive in Venetian territory, he lived comfortably, supported by his hidden wealth and aristocratic friends. When he was eventually murdered for a bounty, he died quickly by the sword, a death deemed honorable for a noble man. The hypocrisy is breathtaking. The justice system of 17th century Italy did not punish the crime of murder. It punished the crime of female transgression. The men who orchestrated the violence, the men who created the suffocating convent system to save their treasuries, and the men who betrayed their accomplices were all allowed to retain their humanity. Virginia, the terrified hostage of their ambitions, was systematically reduced to a feral, starved animal in a hole. The church leadership believed they had solved the problem of the Nun of Monza. They assumed that a woman locked in a freezing, filthy 3 by 6 foot stone box on a diet of stale bread and water would quietly, conveniently expire within a few months, or perhaps a year. They assumed her body would simply give out, allowing them to permanently close the ledger on the de Leyva scandal. They vastly underestimated the terrifying, stubborn biological resilience of the woman they had buried. Virginia Maria de Leyva did not die. As the calendar turned from 1608 to 1609 and then bled into the 1610s, the guards at Santa Valeria continued to pass the bread through the tiny hole in the brickwork, and a skeletal, trembling hand continued to reach up from the darkness to take it. She endured the freezing winters. She endured the suffocating summers. She endured the hallucinations, the scurvy, and the absolute crushing weight of her own regret. She survived for 1 year, then 5 years, then 10 years. The woman in the wall became a dark, terrifying legend within the archdiocese of Milan. The ecclesiastical bureaucrats who had signed her death warrant began to age and die themselves, yet the disgraced countess remained alive in her tomb, a living, breathing monument to the cruelty of the system that had buried her. She was waiting in the dark, her biology refusing to surrender to the patriarchal mandate of her death, pushing toward a final, astonishing chapter that no one in the Catholic hierarchy could have ever predicted. 14 years is not merely a measurement of time. In the context of sensory deprivation and solitary immurement, it is a measurement of absolute biological obliteration. To survive 5,110 days inside a freezing, pitch-black 3 by 6 foot stone box defies every known parameter of human endurance. Yet Virginia Maria de Leyva did not die. She became a terrifying living ghost haunting the foundations of Santa Valeria. As the years ground on, the political landscape of Milan shifted, but her reality remained fixed to the damp stone floor. She was fed through a fist-sized hole. She survived outbreaks of plague that ravaged the city above her, entirely insulated by her tomb. Her body, however, paid the ultimate price for her survival. Her muscles, denied the ability to stretch or walk, severely atrophied, leaving her legs twisted and practically useless. Her skin, untouched by the sun for over a decade, turned a sickly, translucent gray. The absolute darkness destroyed her optic nerves, leaving her nearly blind. But it was her psychological state that underwent the most profound, irreversible transformation. When a human mind is subjected to that level of sustained, inescapable torture, it does not simply wait for rescue. It adapts by completely surrendering to the trauma. The fierce, desperate Countess of Monza, who had forged keys and smuggled an infant out of a convent, was systematically crushed into dust. In her place, the isolation forged a terrified, hyper-compliant shell of a human being. The Inquisition had successfully broken her down to her base components. She was no longer a threat. She was a fully domesticated, traumatized asset. In the autumn of 1622, the machinery of the Catholic Church finally decided that the experiment was complete. Cardinal Federico Borromeo, the architect of her entombment, was aging. He had spent the last 14 years utilizing the Monza scandal to justify his strict, uncompromising reforms of the convent system across Lombardy. Now he needed a final theatrical act of mercy to cement his legacy as a stern but forgiving spiritual father. He ordered the brick wall to be torn down. We must strip away the religious romanticism of this moment and look at the horrifying physical reality of her extraction. When the masons arrived with their chisels and hammers to break the mortar, Virginia was 47 years old, but the woman they pulled from the hole looked ancient. When the first rays of torchlight breached the cell, the physical pain in her ruined eyes must have been blinding. She had to be physically carried out of the filth and the darkness, her crippled legs unable to bear her own weight. She was a frail, trembling, emaciated survivor of state-sponsored torture. Cardinal Borromeo declared that her 14 years of living death had purified her. He officially pronounced her rehabilitated. But the Church did not grant her true freedom. A woman broken by the patriarchal system is never set free. She is simply repurposed. Virginia was not allowed to return to her family, nor was she allowed to live independently. She was transferred to another, slightly larger room within the retreat house of Santa Valeria. She was given back the habit of a nun, but the aristocratic privileges of the de Leyva family were gone forever. Then came the ultimate, most insidious psychological insult of her entire ordeal. Cardinal Borromeo weaponized her survival. He forced Virginia to become a living propaganda tool for the exact same patriarchal hierarchy that had buried her alive. Because her case was the most infamous scandal in Italian history, her words carried massive psychological weight among the other cloistered women of the region. Under the strict supervision of her confessors, the crippled, half-blind woman was ordered to write letters to other nuns across Milan. She was forced to write extensive warnings about the dangers of vanity, the horrific consequences of lust, and the absolute necessity of unquestioning obedience to male authorities. She was made to graphically describe her own sins and her subsequent agonizing penance. The Church paraded her broken psyche as the ultimate cautionary tale. They forced the victim to parrot the ideology of her abusers. Whether Virginia genuinely believed the words she was forced to write, or whether she was simply executing a final exhausted survival mechanism, is a question that remains locked in the history of her trauma. Stockholm Syndrome, profound institutionalization, and the sheer terror of being sent back to the dark hole likely merged into a state of absolute compliance. She had learned the brutal lesson of 17th century justice. Obedience was the only currency that bought the right to breathe. She lived out the rest of her existence in this heavily monitored, quiet obscurity. She never saw her daughter, Alma Francesca Margherita, again. The child had been raised in the Ossio household, forever separated from the mother who had risked her soul to give her life. Virginia spent her final decades praying, fasting, and serving as the terrified mouthpiece for Borromeo's reforms. On January 17, 1650, at the age of 75, Virginia Maria de Leyva finally died. She had survived 32 years after being pulled from the wall. She outlived Count Gianpaolo Ossio, who had been murdered by his own friends. She outlived Cardinal Federico Borromeo. She outlived the father who had sold her to the Church. She survived them all, but she died captive. The scandal of the Nun of Monza did not die with Virginia. Over 2 centuries later, the legendary Italian author Alessandro Manzoni immortalized her story in his masterpiece, The Betrothed. In the novel, she is heavily fictionalized as the Nun of Monza, a Gothic, tragic, and deeply flawed villainess. Manzoni's work cemented her in the global cultural consciousness as a symbol of aristocratic corruption and forbidden lust. When we look back at the life of Virginia Maria de Leyva, we must fundamentally reject the narrative that she was a cold-blooded monster. Her story is a highly documented factual autopsy of patriarchal economics and institutional abuse. The true villains of Monza were not the women locked inside the convent. The true villains were the three men who represented the absolute pillars of 17th century power. Lord Martino de Leyva represented wealth. He evaluated his daughter strictly as a financial liability and threw her away to protect his coffers. Count Gianpaolo Ossio represented violence. He manipulated a starved, desperate woman, endangered her life, and casually butchered a peasant to protect his aristocratic comfort. Cardinal Federico Borromeo represented dogma. He used the full, terrifying weight of the Catholic bureaucracy to psychologically torture a female hostage to protect the political reputation of the Church. Virginia was the anvil upon which these men struck their power. Her life forces a profoundly uncomfortable reevaluation of how we understand historical justice. She was born into a system that demanded she not exist. When she desperately tried to claim a fraction of human autonomy, she was cornered into a nightmare of bloodshed and betrayal. The state and the church did not punish her because she was an accomplice to murder. They punished her because her very existence exposed the horrific, rotting hypocrisy of a society that commodified its daughters, protected its violent sons, and hid its crimes behind the untouchable, holy veil of the altar. Virginia Maria de Leyva was buried alive inside 4 cold stone walls, but the true prison was the society that built them. She stands as a permanent, chilling monument to the women of history whose lives were violently erased simply to balance the ledgers of men.